Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which as we all know is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that one or two will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. Around 1871, a self-taught Assyriologist, George Smith, made an astounding discovery. While translating cuneiform tablets from Nineveh, an ancient city in Mesopotamia, Smith deciphered a description of a great flood in what is now known to be part of the world's first epic poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. What makes his discovery so significant is that this flood predates the one in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, involving Noah and his ark, by at least 1,000 years. Legend has it that Smith was so overcome with excitement that he tore off his clothes and did a streak around the reading room of the British Museum. I like to think that he continued his celebration with a pint or two of beer, after he'd got dressed of course. Which brings us neatly onto today's topic. In today's episode, we will be journeying back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Euphrates and the Tigris, in a region located in modern-day Iraq, parts of Syria, Turkey and Iran. The Mesopotamians, who include the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians, were a clever bunch renowned for their contributions to human history. These include the invention of cuneiform, an early form of writing, as well as advancements in architecture, mathematics and astronomy. But today, we will be discussing something that I'm particularly thankful for, the development of arguably the world's first great beer culture. I am joined by archaeologist and Associate Professor of History at North Carolina State University, Tate Paulette. Tate is also the author of In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. Welcome to the podcast, Tate.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So can you tell me a bit about yourself and how you got into archaeology, or more specifically, the archaeology of beer, which sounds like the best job in the world ever, if I have to say.
Yeah, sure. So I guess like many people, I was interested in archaeology from a pretty young age. And then I ended up doing an undergraduate degree in archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, where I kind of started out interested in the Celtic world. And then I gradually, over the course of it, sort of shifted towards the ancient Near East, or we generally prefer to call Southwest Asia. Now, that was partly because I went and did some field work in Cyprus, where I now run an excavation. But I also wrote my undergraduate dissertation about early writing in Mesopotamia. And so I was moving towards Mesopotamia already. Then I ended up doing an MA and PhD in Mesopotamian archaeology at the University of Chicago. And it was during that I sort of fell into the topic of beer. I had been working on agriculture more generally. I was working on a sort of collaborative project that was digging down into agriculture in Mesopotamia in some depth. I was working on a dissertation about grain storage, so silos and that kind of thing. So, and then a friend and I were basically, at a bar one evening, and we had just barely started looking into the topic of beer. We're both Mesopotamian archaeologists, and we were like, why have we not been working on beer? We had just started, and then he heard that there was going to be a collaboration. There was a brewery in Cleveland, and the owner of the brewery had come to the institute where we were working, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. Back then it was called the Oriental Institute. He had come saying he wanted to do some kind of ancient beer collaboration, and they had hit on Mesopotamia, and they were looking for volunteers. And so the two of us, even though we had just started learning about this topic, we sort of volunteered enthusiastically and joined in that project. So that's how I got into this topic.
Well, that sounds like fun. And we will come back to your beer making experience later on in the podcast. So what sort of dates are we talking about? What sort of period of history are the Mesopotamians in?
The time period, my book does cover much deeper prehistory, but really the time period I'm talking about starts in the vicinity of 3000 BC or so, and then for the next kind of 3,000 years. So geographically, where are we? We're talking about basically modern day Iraq, northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, a region that was sort of centered around these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And that's where the name comes from, Mesopotamia, between the rivers. And so, especially down in southern Mesopotamia, the rivers were absolutely essential. So when you're up in the north, you have enough rainfall for rain-fed agriculture, but down in the south, you really absolutely need irrigation water from the rivers. And so that's our region. And when we're talking about the history of beer in this region, we know a little bit about the deep prehistory, going back to something like 10,000 BC. And I do talk about that, but that's not really my focus. There's been a lot of interesting work lately trying to give us those earliest dates for different alcoholic beverages. But usually we just get little bits of information. We can say, these particular vessels, stone vessels, for example, seem to have once contained beer or wine or something, but we can't say too much more. The story I'm telling sort of fast forwards, which is actually kind of a gap between that really early evidence and when we really start to learn a lot about beer in Mesopotamia, which is the centuries just before 3000 BC. And that's where I say this is the world's first great beer culture. And I say that partly just because this is the first time where we have really rich evidence, where we can paint a kind of complete picture of this, of an early beer culture. And so it's basically from that sort of just before 3000 BC for the next 3 millennia. That's basically my time frame.
Okay. So let's start with a bit of myth busting since we're going back so far. Now, I'm going to assume this is an old chestnut as much in ancient Mesopotamia as it is in the modern Western world or relatively modern history. And that is that one of the common misconceptions that us historians of food and drink face is that people drank beer because the water was so bad. So was this the case? Was the water bad in Mesopotamia?
Well, I mean, my basic answer is, I'm not sure. But definitely, this is a question that I get asked almost every time I talk about this topic to all different sorts of audiences. So it's definitely an idea that's just out there.
Yeah, it is.
In the world. And I'd say, at the least, I can say that I don't think that there's good evidence for it in ancient Mesopotamia, for this being a problem. Yes, we're talking the period I'm talking about right there around 3000 BC. This is the first cities in world history. People are living in much more densely packed settlements than they have before. They are raising animals in large numbers in those settlements. I guess it's possible that they were running into new issues with water quality. It's an interesting topic. Because I'm asked it so much, I kind of want to figure out how to actually address it. But the big question for me is, what would the evidence look like given the kinds of evidence that we have? And I haven't come up with a good solution yet. I mean, I know one example of a medical text from Mesopotamia that says there's a lot of these kind of diagnostic texts. They tell us, here are the symptoms that a person has, and then they tell us what the problem is. And in one case that I know of, it was, you have these symptoms, and it has to do with drinking tainted water. but that's hardly enough to make a
No.
big argument about this. And so it is on my mind as a question that I would like to think about. And interestingly, a review of my book that came out recently highlighted when I'm talking about brewing ingredients, there's one key brewing ingredient that I don't actually talk about, and that is water, which is absolutely right. And so this question of water is on my mind.
Okay. So the jury's still out in a way. But I usually tell people, certainly from the early modern period, well, yeah, no, I mean, some people may have drank tainted water, but generally people, well, while they may not have known why it was tainted, they knew that if you put nasty stuff in your drinking water source, it's not going to be good for people or your livestock. So
yes, I definitely tend towards your perspective on this. And I mean, I think that I also just like to highlight, I mean, often when this question is coming up, it's because they're thinking like, why would people just be drinking beer all the time? How could that be a good thing? And they're trying to figure out why. And I don't know. I like to emphasize that, well, they drank beer in Mesopotamia because they really liked how it tasted. They liked how it made them feel. And so I usually try to kind of redirect it towards those kind of issues.
So what archaeological evidence is there to show from the period you're looking at that beer was drunk? You know, we've got recipes, for example, that exist from this period?
Yeah, so we have basically lots of evidence. We have a lot of written evidence in cuneiform documents. We have archaeological remains like, architectural remains, ceramics, that kind of thing. And we have all kinds of artistic depictions. In terms of just the basic question about, what was this beverage they were drinking, if we're thinking about the written evidence, there's basically two main words that they use to refer to this beverage: kash in the Sumerian language and shikaru in the Akkadian language, which are, I think everyone agrees that we should be translating these as beer. They often have, they also have all different kinds of beer depending on the time period that we're talking about. This beverage that we translate as beer appears alongside wine all the time. People sit down together, they start drinking beer and wine, so they recognize that something similar about those two. And both of these beverages they recognize that when people drink them, they have effects on people that we would associate with alcohol consumption. I wouldn't say we have recipes exactly. There is nothing that just says, here is how you brew this kind of beer or something. What we do have from particular periods are kind of like ingredient lists. So already in some of the very earliest documents you have from about 3000 BC, beer is already all over the place in those documents. And we have a great group of them that relate to a particular guy who might have been a brewery manager, basically a brewer. And there's one of these texts that I talk about in my book. It's really great. It's basically one side of the tablet is showing us, it's got 4 different types of beer on it, and it's showing us exactly how many jars of each type of beer were delivered to a series of different people. So it's documenting beer deliveries from a brewery. Then you flip the tablet over on the back, and what it's doing is calculating, it's totaling up all of those jars of each type of beer, and then it's calculating the ingredients that went into brewing those jars of beer. And in that case, the ingredients are basically malted barley and sort of crushed barley. But there's a lot of challenges of translation in these earliest texts. If we move forward, say 600 years or so, we have another set that are of tablets that are doing something similar from the city of Girsu in Iraq. These are basically sort of delivery accounts also, where they're documenting the ingredients that were used, very specific quantities of specific ingredients that were used to brew specific volumes of beer, which is really useful for us for basically 5 different types of beer. We had a golden beer, a dark beer, a sweet dark beer, a reddish brown beer, and then a strained beer. So we get a lot of info there. So we have scattered bits of evidence like that, these kind of ingredient lists, but they're coming from administrative documents. Then the other thing you can do is we have some literary depictions of the brewing of beer. Some often just little snippets, but the most famous of these is known as the hymn to Ninkasi.
It sounds a lot like a modern craft sort of beer place, doesn't it, in terms of the variety that were available? So I have to ask, what or who was Ninkasi? And why did you pick this name for your book?
Yes. So Ninkasi was the goddess of beer in Mesopotamia. So that hymn to Ninkasi that I just described, that's basically a sort of song praising Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. We have this named goddess, and then this was very much a land of beer drinkers. They did have access to grape wine, but that was more a product from the kind of wetter and hillier regions surrounding Mesopotamia. And barley was their dominant grain crop, which is great for brewing beer. So this was a land of beer drinkers. And so that's where I kind of get this land of Ninkasi. And the way that she is depicted, we don't have that much information about her, but she is primarily depicted as a brewer. So that hymn praising her, and the reason that it has gotten a lot of attention is in order to sort of praise the goddess, it gives us a series of little snapshots of her at work in the brewery doing the key activities of the brewer. And for a long time, people have thought that it looks like it's kind of organized in a step-by-step fashion, which makes it really our best description of how the brewing process might have worked. But I spend quite a lot of time in the book sort of cautioning us about how much information we ought to try to get from that. So we have this goddess of beer who is a brewer especially. Then there is actually another goddess of beer called Sirash, who we also don't know that much about. It's at least possible, though, that she was more associated with the beer itself. They do use her name in many cases as a way to write beer. And so we have these we have these two sort of beer goddesses.
So who was making the beer then? I mean, I'm curious because we had certainly in Britain a culture of women originally making beer, sort of in the early medieval period, alewives as they were called. Was it similar in Mesopotamia, or was it especially as you have a goddess of beer? I'm more curious. Was it women that were making the beer?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think just to go back to this goddess issue, there are at least hints that as you move later in time, these two goddesses of beer might sort of transform into gods of beer. There is a sort of over time in Mesopotamia, less attention being placed on female deities. It is possible that goes alongside a sort of shift in the brewing industry. People, I think, often want to connect it up to this history that you're talking about in England, where you see this shift from sort of small scale brewing under the control of women to it being pulled out and turned into a like more prestigious profession under the control of men. I think we have little interesting hints about that, but I don't think we can yet really make the argument. So in terms of who was doing the brewing, so we have kind of three levels that we can talk about. For example, if we're talking about the written material, we have brewing that's happening in breweries, which are basically institutional breweries, often managed by the palace or by the temple. And the people managing the brewing of the beer, brewers, there are both male and female brewers that appear, but I think that it seems to be a profession that's dominated by men. Then you have a sort of middle level where you have tavern-based brewing going on. And what's hard is that because in Mesopotamia in general, most of the texts were being produced by scribes who were working for these institutions, and a lot of these texts are accounting documents and things. So when you move away from the institutions and into the tavern, which was basically a space managed by private individuals, we don't have nearly as much in the cuneiform record. So where we see those, for example, is where they intersect with the state. For example, when they're paying taxes to the state, we have tavern keepers showing up. There are both male and female tavern keepers. For example, in some of those tax documents, there are male tavern keepers. But if we look at another realm of evidence, which is the literary world, so stories of all different kinds, I think it's pretty clear that tavern keepers are women in the literary world, at least. And so we have that, and then we have home brewing, which appears even less in the official record, and so we really have just little bits of info about that. And in the written record, the evidence that I know of comes from things like letters. So we have some wonderful letters from what's called the Old Assyrian period, where there's this international trading system linking up the city of Ashur in northern Mesopotamia with a place called Kanesh, way up in central Anatolia. And we have all these letters written back and forth from people on either side of this trading system. And a kind of subset of those are written between husbands and wives who are often living separately, or at least the husbands were moving back and forth. And sometimes when they're writing to each other, domestic issues come up and they talk about brewing ingredients. And in those cases that I know of, it's the woman who is doing the brewing.
Ah, well, that's good to know. So we've talked a bit about where beer's made and who was brewing it. And you've mentioned that it appears in literary forms. So as well as a great flood, beer also crops up in the Epic of Gilgamesh. What is Gilgamesh's best friend, Enkidu's, first experience with beer?
Yes, we have this really a kind of pivotal episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh that involves beer. So we have this wild man Enkidu who's been created to sort of go in and challenge, go into the city of Uruk and challenge Gilgamesh. But he's living in the wild. He basically is living with the herd of gazelle and, grazing with them and drinking from pools with them and things. And so before he can come in and confront Gilgamesh in the city, he has to be basically transformed from this wild man into a civilized human being. And so we see they have to shave him and anoint him with oil and give him clothes to wear. But also fundamental thing is he has to learn how to eat and drink like a human. And that means eating bread and drinking beer. So we have this great scene where Enkidu drinks 7 goblets of beer and his face lights up and he begins to sing. And so, you have at the heart of this story, this famous story, not famous just for us. This was a key story for them that everyone would have known. Now, this early in the text, one of these pivotal moments, we have this image situating beer at the heart of what it is to be a civilized human being.
It's shades of Brave New World, or rather, I should say, shades of the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps in Huxley's book, Brave New World. Who drank the beer then? And was it the same beer for everyone? What were the beers that were available? You mentioned the different coloured or sort of tones of beer. Were they affected in strength, and were they designed, therefore, for certain times of the day or certain parts of the populace?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we learn about all different kinds of beer in the cuneiform record. The types of beer vary by period, for sure. So I told you about some earlier that are basically color-based labels. But then in other periods, we definitely have kind of ordinary beer, good beer, very good beer. You have indications alongside that might have to do with basically increasing malt content in these beers, and so maybe increasing alcohol content. So there are potential traces of what you're talking about, beers of different strength. There have been a lot of arguments about the alcohol content of this beer. Was it, for example, a small beer? Some people think that some of these beers could have been really low in alcohol content, 0.5% or something. I tend to push back against that. I don't think it's impossible that some of the beers were that sort of very low alcohol range. But what I always say is that when you look at the literary record, when they talk about beer, they think of it as something that impacted people in a way that we recognize alcohol impacting people. So yes, there were different kinds of beer, different qualities of beer. The answer to your question about who was drinking it and how do these things connect up. So on the one hand, everyone was drinking beer. This was available. We have evidence for prisoners of war, enslaved people drinking beer, construction workers, carpenters, musicians, messengers, scribes, governors, kings, queens. Everyone was drinking beer. I think we do have hints of what you're saying of, for example, the kind of ordinary versus good versus very good, that the ordinary beer was often being distributed to larger groups of people, whereas the very good beer was for a more restricted set of people. I think we can assume, based on the evidence that we have, that who you were in society did have a lot to do with what kind of beer you had access to. I think there's also often a question about gender, and there's plenty of evidence for both men and women across the social spectrum having access to beer. We have, well, there's lots, but also just if we look at the artistic record, for example, we have, especially during the early Bronze Age, sort of the third millennium BC, there's a whole bunch, hundreds and hundreds of depictions of what we call banquet scenes, which is sort of elite groups of people sitting around drinking beer. And some of them have only men drinking, some only women, and many are both men and women drinking together in the same context.
Good. Pleased to hear it. Now, one thing that struck me in the book when I was reading it, and I hope I've got this right, did they use straws to drink beer?
Yes.
And why? Because that, I mean, again, this may be a myth. I've never actually tried drinking a pint of beer through a straw, but I gather it gets you drunk more quickly. I think that might be an old wives' tale. But anyway, I was intrigued. Drinking beer through a straw. Why would they do that?
I certainly have tried it myself. Yes. Not surprisingly. Yeah. So that is kind of the classic way to depict beer drinking in Mesopotamia. For example, in these banquet scenes that I was just talking about, many of them show usually two people sitting to either side of a communal vessel, and there are straws sticking up out of it, and those people are drinking through those straws. Often there are more straws to give you an indication that this wasn't just necessarily for two people. So you have this tradition of drinking through long straws from a communal vessel, which is actually sort of cross-culturally. There's lots of evidence for sharing alcoholic beverages in this way. I don't know about the specific issue you brought up of whether it gets you drunk quicker. It's definitely a different experience drinking through a straw, and it does feel like it kind of hits you differently for sure. But so yeah, we have these banquet scenes. There's another scene that I talk about in the book a good bit, which is we have not as many of those, but where we have two people having sex, and the woman is drinking beer through a straw during that. And so we have these two classic images of beer consumption through a straw. In general, these straws would have been reeds, which are organic, and so they don't survive well at all archaeologically. And so we have some fancy metal versions of straws that appear every once in a while. But we also have these wonderful little filters that are little bronze sort of finger-length filters with little holes perforating them that would have been attached to the end of the reed straw and then submerged it down into the beer to serve a filtering function. And so we don't have a ton of those, but I think it's a good indication. Many people assume that, well, why were they drinking through straws? Probably because it helped to filter the beer to some extent. So there must have been some kind of solid matter. So that's generally one of the assumptions. But I think also just the communal aspect, it makes it a very different kind of consumption when you're drinking together from a shared vessel. We do have plenty of depictions of people drinking from cups, individually held cups. I don't think we feel as confident saying they are meant to be drinking beer from those, but we do also have organic residue analysis that's been done on some goblet-like vessels that show us that they were definitely sometimes drinking beer from cups.
So how was drunkenness generally viewed? Do we know? Has there been sort of any documentation that's been left to say how being inebriated was viewed in Mesopotamia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. They don't actually talk about drunkenness all that often. So if you compare this to, say, ancient Egypt, which I don't know the evidence super well, but there are, for example, depictions of just drunken people having to be carried out of their, after a round of drinking. There's also a special festival called the Drunkenness of Hathor Festival, where the whole point was to drink as much as possible to reach this kind of ecstatic state where you experience the goddess. So I don't know of anything like that in Mesopotamia. They definitely do occasionally talk about the sort of excessive effects of alcohol consumption. Sometimes we get hints about that in the medical literature where they're describing symptoms that seem to relate to drinking too much beer or wine. The classic example, though, from literature that I know of is called the tale of Inanna and Enki. So we have the goddess Inanna, the god Enki. We start out with Inanna, at home, getting herself all dressed up really fancy so that she can go to visit Enki, possibly, we don't really know, but possibly explicitly with the goal of gaining control over Enki has control over a whole series of what are called the May, which is a difficult to translate term, but it's kind of like, often it's called the arts of civilization or something. It's like all the things that made Mesopotamian civilization what it was, many of these were under his control, and it's possible that she was going there to try to take some of these or get some of these. She goes to his house, he sets up a feast, they start drinking together, and then we have a break in the text. And when the text picks up again, what we see is Enki just giving her one of these powers after another. And it lists off all these different powers that he's giving away. We have another break in the text. And then what we get is this great scene of him kind of like waking up from his drunken stupor and looking around and saying, "Where's all my stuff? Where are all my powers?" And then he has this minister who's been sitting there watching the whole thing. And he says, "Well, you just gave them all away." And so we have a little, maybe like a cautionary tale here telling us about the dangers of excessive beer consumption.
Well, it happens to the best of us, I would suggest. We've all had too much drink in the past and given away things perhaps that we shouldn't have. So you've actually tried making Mesopotamian beer. You talked about it a little bit at the beginning. Can you tell us more about your experiment and what the beer was like?
Yeah, sure. So again, this is basically how I got into this topic, how I sort of fell into the topic of beer, was being thrown into the middle of this effort to recreate Mesopotamian beer. This was a very collaborative thing, a team of maybe 15 people or something like that. From our side, which was, again, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago. So we had a mixture of archaeologists and what are called Assyriologists. So that's people who really focus on the written material. And then on the other side, we had a team of brewers from Great Lakes Brewing in Cleveland. And this was basically a multi-year experimental effort to try to recreate Mesopotamian beer. And from the beginning, we had to make some decisions. What kind of project would this be? So, for example, there was a lot of work done by Dogfish Head Brewing in collaboration with our archaeologist Pat McGovern. He did organic residue analysis, and he would travel all different parts of the world trying to figure out what were some of the key ingredients used to brew beverages in this particular place. And then this brewery would recreate them, but they recreated them usually on their modern brewing equipment, and they bottled them for distribution. The beers, or often they were hybrid beverages like beer/wine/mead, and they were often pretty high in alcohol content, pretty carbonated. And so they were really interesting, but I don't know that they were not aiming, I think, for extreme authenticity in their recreation. So we decided, well, let's see if we can do something different and at least aim for authentic ingredients, but also authentic brewing equipment and a brewing process. Of course, there are huge gaps in our knowledge, which is a bit of a theme in my book, probably. I try to be really upfront about, well, here's exactly what we know and how we know it, but there's also quite a lot that we still don't know, sort of puzzles that we still need to solve.
You do it very well, I should say. It's an excellent book.
Glad.
And you're not misleading anyone at all, but it's still, even with the gaps in the knowledge, it's a fascinating book.
So we did our best. It was a really interesting back and forth with the brewers, because, I mean, it's a very different thing. If you're somebody like me, you sit down, you might know the archaeological evidence well, and you try to write up how might they have brewed their beer, which is actually how this whole thing started. The brewer said, okay, well, can you give us a description of how they brewed the beer? And we did our best, and we sent it to them. And then they gave us maybe 30 questions in response, many of them very, very difficult, that would have taken years of research to try to answer. And so we had this interesting back and forth, because it really highlights the difference of bringing in these professional brewers who know these kind of ingredients and processes in a totally different way. And so this sort of raising of questions that I would have just never thought about, to me, is one of the real values of doing this kind of experimental work. In any case, so we got ceramicists to make replica ceramic vessels for us. We brewed all of our beers using those and our best approximation of the process. And then we held, I think, 6 or 7 tasting events in different cities over a number of years, where The brewers would give a little talk, I would give a talk, and then we would let people try the beers. We would let them try them in tasting glasses. And what we always did was we would brew. We had two beers, Inky Brew and Gilgamesh. Inky Brew was the kind of more authentic one, the wilder one, that was brewed using the replica brewing equipment. And then we would make another beer using their modern equipment and basically the same ingredients largely, and let people try those next to each other. And they were very different. And then we also always at the end would let people try the Inky Brew from a communal vessel through straws. So now many
Excellent.
people who had not tried, many people who had never tried beer through a straw now have.
That was going to be my next question. So please tell me you got them to drink it through a straw. Were there any other aromatics in there as well that perhaps would be more unusual in today's brewing?
It's a great question. I mean, because when you're trying to think about what would these beers have tasted like, that's one of the big questions, and most frustrating questions. Because we know that they didn't have hops, this key flavoring ingredient in our beers, and also important for its antimicrobial properties, for preservative purposes and things. They didn't have. And they do talk about aromatics sometimes, but they use a very general phrase for it. And so we really don't know exactly what they were adding. Especially as we get later in Mesopotamian history, there's one plant called kasu in the Akkadian language that is being used in beers. We know that it's being used. There's actually an interesting shift or addition over time. Late in Mesopotamian history, they start making a date wine, but they call it the same thing as beer. But they then are brewing both barley beer and date wine. And we know that they were using this kasu in the date wine. And there's hints that they were also sometimes using it for barley beer. The problem is that there is no consensus about how we translate that term and exactly what plant that was. And so it's a really frustrating thing. When we did these early brewing experiments, we basically gave the brewers a list of all kinds of things that we know were available in Mesopotamia, and we let them choose. They typically went with things that were at least relatively familiar to them, things like juniper and coriander. In the past few months, did a little bit more experimental brewing with a brewery here in Raleigh, where I live, a brewery called Trophy Brewing. Basically, there was an event in September where Alton Brown, this kind of food writer and TV personality, was going to be part of the event. And I was asked if I would be interested in brewing some Mesopotamian beer for him to taste with him on stage. And so I collaborated with this local brewery. And in that case, we tried to make some of those specific beers that were from those girsu recipes. Like we made a golden beer and a dark beer. Because of the uncertainty about aromatics, we decided that we wouldn't actually use any in our main brewing efforts, but that what we would do is create a series of kind of herbal tinctures that people could add with little droppers to the finished product to see what that might have tasted like. So we did juniper and cardamom and hyssop. And so we tasted these beers on stage with him and had him try the different flavorings to be added in. But it's a huge question and a very uncertain one.
And did he have a particular favorite?
I think he liked the dark beer. He found it really interesting. So these beers turned out pretty sour, pretty tart. We were, in this experimental effort, we were trying to recreate these particular recipes. And in these recipes, they both have malted barley in them. So that's a real point of connection to our own beers, right? Malted barley is fundamental for most of our own beers. One of them the golden beer had emmer wheat in it. The dark beer had a less certain ingredient that might have been a sort of roasted or toasted barley product. But then both also had this ingredient called bapir, just the Sumerian word for it. It's one of the two key ingredients in Mesopotamian beer, malted barley and bapir, but there are big questions about what it actually was and lots of disagreement. We leaned into one particular interpretation, and we'd used the same interpretation for my previous experiments, which is that it might have been a sort of dried out sourdough culture that was actually the source of yeast for the beer. And so when we just did this recent brewing, we really focused on trying to, given our uncertainties, be as accurate as we could about that bapir. So my kitchen was full of, I got some sourdough cultures from some colleagues, and I was just feeding them all over the place. And then I was trying different methods of basically creating different sorts of loaves or cakes and then drying them out either in the oven, or I had a dehydrator. I tried different things, trying to figure out what would work. And so it's not surprising that our beers turned out pretty sour. They had mellowed by the time we tasted them on stage. That element had mellowed enough that you could get some of the other flavors. The dark beer in particular, you got this sort of roasty, chocolatey, even a little bit of smokiness, because we smoked this one ingredient over a fire. So yes, I think that was his favorite. And we did try them from tasting glasses, but we also tried them from a communal vessel. And someone had made us fancy blown glass straws that looked like reeds. And so we used those to taste it out of the communal vessel.
So each season of the podcast, I invite my guests to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And usually I like it to be connected to the theme, but, water is quite a tricky one. So I'm going to ask you what you will be bringing to the season's potluck supper, and anything goes. I'm going to be kind to my guests this season.
Okay, well, what I've chosen has water in it, also has beer in it. So I hope that will be a good connection. So what I've chosen is a stew from ancient Mesopotamia called tuhu. We don't know exactly what the meaning of that term was, but we know a lot about how this stew was made. This comes from what are known as the Yale culinary tablets, basically 3 cuneiform tablets that have some wonderful evidence for recipes. And actually, we don't have very many recipes like this in Mesopotamian history, so these are pretty unique. One of the tablets has a bunch of recipes for soups or like stews of some kind, and then the others have more detailed recipes. Like there's one recipe that's a kind of pie that has little birds inside of it. It's super detailed. Yeah, it's fun. I often have my students do a Mesopotamian cooking project where they get in groups and then they cook some recipes at home and they document the whole process. And they're actually just finishing it up right now. So in class tomorrow, they're going to do their presentations. And I know that at least one group has made this particular stew because they've sent photos of it and it looks good. What this is basically you're taking a leg of mutton, cooking it a little bit in some rendered sheep fat, and then you're adding in onions, and then later on red beets, arugula, cilantro, Persian shallot, and cumin. Then you add some beer, and then you add some water, basically bring it up to a boil, reduce the heat. Then you add some crushed leek and garlic, and then you basically simmer it until it's thickened. And then there's some flavorings that you add on top. Kurat, cilantro, and crushed coriander seeds. So
nice. I'm quite relieved they're making the stew and not the pie with the birds in.
Yeah, that's what
I thought. I thought you were going with that. I was like, oh my god, that's that's quite brave.
Some students last year made that pie, but they did not put little birds in it. I think they bought some chicken at the store and put it in. But it was actually very impressive because it's a very detailed, lengthy recipe, especially the pie making part of it. And I thought they did a nice job.
So what's next on the horizon for you?
Well, I'm currently editing a volume about wine in the ancient world, so sticking in the same kind of realm. Coming out of this recent event where we brewed this beer for tasting, I'm also collaborating with some yeast specialists on campus to dig into this question of Bapier and if it were a sort of dried out starter, how that process might have worked. In a broader sense, I've been trying to dig down into it's a kind of more abstract question, but I talked a little bit about my interest in agriculture before. I've been trying to think about how it is that we should be talking about agriculture in an animist world. So in ancient Mesopotamia, we know that they had these kind of anthropomorphic deities living up in the sky and down below, but they also recognized all kinds of other animate presences in their world. And so I'm trying to sort of dig down into this and think about it. Well, should we be writing about topics like agriculture in a different way if we were recognizing that for them, the universe had all of these different kinds of animate presences in it? So a little more abstract, but that's something I'm starting to explore.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading the book on wine as well. Another beverage that I'm particularly fond of. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tate. It's been absolutely fascinating. I will put links to your book in the show notes so that everyone can go and buy it. And I do highly recommend it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it myself, and I'm sure many of my listeners will as well. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You can find links to Tate's book, In the Land of Ninkasi, in the show notes. You can also read a fictionalised account of George Smith's cuneiform discovery in Elif Shafak's wonderful novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky. And you can find a link to that and the other books mentioned in this season of the podcast on the bookshelf page of the Comfortably Hungry Substack. I've also taken a leaf out of Tate's student's book and had a go at making a Babylonian stew, naturally using beer. I'll be sharing the recipe for that with the paid subscribers of the Comfortably Hungry Substack next week. The next episode of the podcast will be closer to home, both in miles and years, when I find out how bogs in Ireland have been used to preserve food in the past. I'll be back with that episode in a couple of weeks. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays, and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.